this scenario and say that, well, here, so to speak, we have to make some accommodation to the yetzer hara, for which there are many answers. I don't know, they all resonate. And at the end of the day, there are many times that the question is better than the answers. It's never really resolved. But one thing is certain, that in war, when violence is loosed, so then the yetzer hara regarding sexuality is also loosed. And that's an obvious description of what goes on in war events. In the Second World War, when the Russians came to Germany, they made it almost a policy. Most of the German children born after the war were Russians. And because of that, therefore, this idea is that the circumstances of war are so brutal, and that in order to participate in it, so to speak, one has to release moral compunctions in order to be able to be successful in war. So therefore, that's why in war, this concept of Yifas Tohar was introduced, even though the Torah warns us against its consequences and points out that no real good will come from it, but nevertheless, it became a fact. The type of war that existed in ancient days was much more personal than the type of war that, God forbid, occurs today. Today, the Air Force shoots a missile from 30 miles away, doesn't see its victims. And it's even true in infantry combat, etc. It's far different. In the ancient world, it was very personal. It was person to person, close hand quarters. So that required a degree of violence that's greater than what it was required today. And maybe when that degree of violence existed, and people were so to speak, stripped of their humanity, so that's lo dibra Torah lo keneged yetzer hara. There's a second idea that the parsha talks about immediately thereafter. Ki yisiyena leish shtei noshim. A man has two wives. Now, in the ancient world, polygamy was not only permitted, many times it was necessary. And we find in the Torah, for instance, Avram Avinu, and we find Yaakov, the Ovos, the Imohos, lived under polygamous situations. Now, none of them turned out well. Hagar and Sarah eventually produced a Yishmael, and Rachel and Leah, so that the story of Yosef and the splitting of the Shvatim and that whole story. But nevertheless, it was an accepted norm. It was accepted that people could have more than one wife at the same time. Part of the reason was that women in the ancient world were completely defenseless. Were unable to fend on their own. And therefore, many times, the taking of the other wife was a favor to her, because it provided her with a home and a protector and someone to take care of her needs, where otherwise she would be desolate and without any resources. Nevertheless, the Gemara already speaks against polygamy. And in the language of the Gemara, the second wife is called a tzora. It's a trouble. It's a narrowness of vision regarding the other wife. It's very hard to see how it could work out without personal animosity and jealousy and all sorts of problems. But nevertheless, again, in the Middle Eastern world, practically till our time, even in our time, in the Muslim world that exists today, without any problems to them. I think they're allowed 4 wives, which is punishment enough. But in the Christian world, so you have to have a viewpoint of what happened here. In the Christian world, the church became its definition of holiness was that people should be celibate. So therefore they constructed a celibate clergy that doesn't marry, with all of the problems that we see over and over again that creates, because that's also abnormal. But the church basically always was anti-marriage. And it said, almost explicitly, that marriage is only for the common people. But for the elite, the clergy, they don't need it. And they shouldn't participate in it. And that it's an act of unholy behavior. And because of that, therefore, there grew an attitude, because the Jews never had that attitude, but there grew an attitude that if the Jews would have 2 wives, so that is just rampant immorality. That's something that can't be justified under any circumstances. So because of that, in the 10th century, the end of the 10th century, in the yeshiva of Mainz, which was the great yeshiva of the Ashkenazim. Then the Ashkenazim were a very small group. There maybe were only 5,000 Ashkenazim in the whole world. But in the yeshiva of Mainz, rabanu Gershon Me'or Agola, who was from the Gaonim, and he was the man that established Ashkenazic halachic principles. So he convened the scholars of the time, and they banned polygamy. And they said that it was not permissible under any circumstances, and that was called cherem de rabanu gershon, because anyone that violated it would be isolated from the Jewish community. They passed other charomim as well, not to read someone else's mail or messages. So Jews used to safeguard themselves. They sent a messenger to deliver a letter to somebody, so they wanted to safeguard themselves that the messenger wouldn't read the letter. So they would write on it, Beis Ches Daled Reish Gimel B'Chadrag B'Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershon. And that was held to be sufficient. Jews would not violate the Chayim Rabbeinu Gershon. And there were other charomim that he passed. In fact, there's almost 100 of them that are listed for us. But the one that's remembered the most is the Chayim Rabbeinu Gershon having to do with polygamy. There were exceptions built into the Chayim. Under certain circumstances, a man would be allowed to take another wife. The circumstances are very extreme, but they exist. So then there was a heter of Meir Rabbonim built into the Cherem, out of 100 rabbis from 3 different communities would sign on a heter. So then that would be permissible for the man to marry again, take another wife. So for instance, if a man is let's say a young person, and he didn't have children yet, and his wife, Rahman al-Islam, suffered a mental, cerebral incident that she's gone forever. So he cannot give her a divorce. I mean, she can't accept the divorce because she's not there. On the other hand, to say that he can never remarry, so that would be the exception, one of the types of exception to the Chayim Rabbeinu Gershon. Now, like all legal loopholes, this has often been abused. It's been used in cases. But basically, the Chayim Rabbeinu Gershon holds fast. Now, since he was in Mainz, and his influence was on the Chachmei Ashkenaz, it never took hold in the Sephardic world. They never accepted the Cherem, and it never was enforced in the Sephardic world. And the Sephardic Rabbonim, to a great extent, ignored it. And therefore, again, till our time, in the Jews that lived in the Middle East, in the Sephardic world, the truly Sephardic world, so they practiced polygamy, not in great numbers, but it was not forbidden. When the state of Israel was created, so the rabbanut faced the problem, as did the state, and they came up with the solution that anyone who had 2 wives could keep them, but from now on there would be no polygamy in the state of Israel.
Except for the Bedouin.
Except what?
For the Bedouin.
Well, we're not talking about. They're in a different chayim.
The Cherem the Bituach Leumi.
That's right.
Was the Chayim only for 1,000 years?
So there are those that say it was only for 1,000 years, but you'll be happy to know that in 1930 it was renewed. So it's by people who said it was for 1,000 years. But today it's accepted practice everywhere in the Jewish world that polygamy is not allowed, and that the cherem is enforceable. So again, the Torah speaks about a case that's dependent on society, and when society changes, the Torah itself allows for the matter to somehow dissipate and disappear. And that's part of the idea. I just want to conclude it. This is part of the idea that the next parsha, Ben Sorah or Morah, so there are many that say Lahoya v'lo nivra l'drosh v'kabel schar. This entire section, so to speak, these cases are all not fixed in stone. They are theoretical to teach us about people and society, but they are not necessarily to be applicable in life itself. Rabbi Chananya ben Akash Omer